Giant Cowboy hadn't touched a woman in 10 years until she begged, "Help me down from this horse." Folks in Willow Creek said he was the mountain that never moved, quiet, alone, and buried in grief. He never looked twice at anyone, until she rode in, barely clinging to the saddle, heavy with child and worn to the bone. She didn't ask for pity, just one thing: help me down. That moment broke something open in him. But this ain't just a tale of kindness. She's running, from a man who wants her land, and from a secret deed tied to the most precious spring in the county. What she carries isn't just a baby, it's a future someone's willing to kill for. Now the cowboy who turned his back on the world must decide. Will he risk everything for one woman, one child, and one last chance to do what's right? Your reactions remind me why these stories matter. If you still believe in the quiet power of love, justice, and truth, then you're part of the reason I keep sharing them. The Easter morning sun cast long shadows across Willow Creek's dusty main street. Boone Calder's muscled arms hefted another load of coal into the forge, the familiar weight grounding him in his daily routine. The metal scoop scraped against the bin as he dumped it in, sending up little puffs of black dust that settled on his leather apron. Preacher Morrison passed by, Bible tucked under his arm. "Beautiful morning the Lord's given us, Boone." Boone touched the brim of his hat, giving his usual silent acknowledgement. The bells of First Methodist started their cheerful song, calling the faithful to Easter service. He watched the townspeople in their Sunday best make their way down the boardwalk, women in flowered bonnets, men in pressed suits, children skipping along in polished shoes. The sound of hammer-striking anvil filled his smithy, drowning out the hymns floating on the spring breeze. Boone preferred it that way. 10 years was a long time to avoid church gatherings, but the memories were still too raw. He could still see Annabeth's yellow dress, hear her laugh as she promised to meet him after services that Sunday morning in Red Fork. Neither of them knew it would be their last conversation. The horseshoe he was shaping glowed orange hot as he lifted it from the forge. Each strike of his hammer was precise, practiced, the motion as natural as breathing after all these years. The metal slowly took shape under his careful attention. Old Gus from the feed store stuck his head in around mid-morning. "Got them oats you wanted, Boone? Reckon you'll be needin' more soon with spring plantin' time here." Boone nodded, reaching for his coin purse. Their transaction was brief, comfortable in its familiarity. A few ranch hands came by later, needing repairs to worn tack. Boone worked in silence, letting his skilled hands speak for him. The sun had climbed high overhead when he heard the uneven clip-clop of a struggling horse. He glanced up from his work, squinting against the bright light. A sorrel mare stumbled to a stop right in front of his shop, her coat dark with sweat. The woman slumped over her neck wore a dusty dress, her bonnet askew. "Please." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried clearly in the midday quiet. "Help me down from this horse." Boone moved without thinking. 3 long strides took him to the horse's side, his big hands gentle as they reached up to steady the woman. She practically fell into his arms, light as a bird despite her swollen belly. The mare stood trembling, head hanging low, while curious faces began appearing in doorways up and down the street. "Thank you," the woman breathed, her face pale beneath streaks of trail dust. Her eyes fluttered closed as she sagged against him. Boone's heart hammered against his ribs, the first time in years he'd held someone so close. For a moment he froze, old grief warring with present necessity. Then his practical nature took over. She needed help, and he was the one here to give it. "Mrs. Potter," he called out, his voice rough from disuse. The seamstress across the way started at hearing him speak. "Fetch Widow Chen, if you would. Tell her she's needed." The woman in his arms stirred. "My baby," she murmured. "I had to keep riding." "You're safe now," Boone said quietly. surprising himself with the words. He lifted her as carefully as he would handle spun glass, carrying her through the wide doors of his smithy. The workspace was neat, despite the coal dust and tools, with a cot in the back corner where he sometimes slept during busy seasons. He laid her gently on the cot, grabbing his cleanest work cloth to make a pillow. Her face was young, but drawn with exhaustion, dark circles shadowing her eyes. Boone noticed fading bruises at her temple, partially hidden by her disheveled hair. More townspeople were gathering outside now. Boone could hear their murmured conversations, see their shadows in the doorway. He positioned himself between them and the cot, protective instinct rising unexpected but strong. Sarah Potter hurried in, her teenage daughter trailing behind with a pitcher of water. "Widow Chen's coming straight away," she said, already moving to loosen the strange woman's collar. "Poor thing looks half dead from the trail. Rebecca, wet a cloth for her face." Boone stepped back, letting the women take over. He should have felt relieved to be free of the responsibility, but something kept him rooted nearby. The woman's eyes opened briefly, finding his face. "I'm Claire," she whispered. "Claire Whitley. I didn't know where else to go." "You're in Willow Creek," Boone told her. "I'm Boone Calder. The midwife's coming." Widow Chen arrived moments later, her small figure radiating quiet authority as she shooed the onlookers back. "This lady needs air and quiet," she announced firmly. "Mr. Calder, if you would tend to her horse, the rest of you can go about your business." Boone nodded, grateful for the familiar task. The sorrel mare hadn't moved from where she stood, sides heaving. He led her to the water trough, then into the shade of his small stable. Her hooves were worn nearly raw. She'd carried her precious burden a long way. As he curry-combed the exhausted horse, Boone found his thoughts returning to the woman, to Claire, lying on his cot. Something about her desperate arrival had cracked the shell he'd built around himself, letting in feelings he'd thought long buried: concern, compassion, the urge to protect. He could hear Widow Chen's calm voice mixing with Mrs. Potter's worried tones, Claire's occasional soft responses. The familiar sounds of his smithy, hammer on anvil, bellows feeding the forge, coal settling in the bin, were transformed by their presence. The workspace felt different, warmer somehow, more alive. Boone leaned against the stable door, watching the townspeople disperse back to their Easter celebrations. 10 years of careful isolation had been breached by a single plea for help. He wasn't sure whether to be troubled or grateful, but he knew with bone-deep certainty that his orderly world had shifted on its axis. The sorrel mare nickered softly, pushing her nose against his shoulder. Boone patted her neck, remembering the feel of Claire's slight weight in his arms, the trust in her exhausted eyes when she'd told him her name. Whatever had driven her to make such a desperate journey, she'd chosen his smithy as her haven. He couldn't help wondering if perhaps Providence had played a hand in that choice. Widow Chen emerged from the smithy, wiping her hands on her apron. "The lady needs rest, proper food, and a more comfortable place to sleep than that cot." She fixed Boone with a stern look. "Your loft would suit better." Boone's shoulders tensed. No one had been in his private space since before Red Fork. But the midwife was right. A pregnant woman needed better than a hard cot in a sooty workspace. He climbed the narrow stairs to the loft, his boots heavy on each step. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light, streaming through the small window. The space was spare but neat. A trunk of clothes, a shelf of books, his mother's old quilt on the narrow bed. He opened the window to let in fresh air, then pulled out the folding cot he kept for emergencies. When he returned downstairs, Claire was sitting up, sipping water from a tin cup. Some color had returned to her cheeks, though exhaustion still lined her face. Mrs. Potter had helped her smooth her hair and straighten her dress. "Ma'am," Boone said quietly, "there's a proper bed upstairs if you'd like." He hesitated, then added, "It's private. Safe." Claire's fingers tightened around the cup. I couldn't impose. It's no imposition. The words came easier than he expected. You need rest. Widow Chen nodded approvingly. I've sent for Hattie Bell. She's the best midwife in 3 counties. Now, Mr. Calder, help this lady upstairs before she falls over. Boone offered his arm, steadying Claire as she rose. She was stronger than she looked, but the stairs challenged her. Each step was careful, measured. When they reached the loft, she paused, one hand pressed to her swollen belly. The baby's restless today, she said softly. All that riding, I suppose. Boone gestured to the bed. My mother's quilt. It's clean. Claire sank onto the mattress with a grateful sigh. I'll only stay a night or 2, she promised. Just until the baby settles. I've imposed enough already. A knock at the street door announced Hattie Bell's arrival. The midwife bustled up the stairs, her medical bag in hand. Well now, let's have a look at you and your little one. She shooed Boone away with practiced authority. Go on, Mr. Calder. Woman's business now. Boone retreated to his forge, grateful for the familiar routine of work. The broken plowshare needed attention. Spring planting wouldn't wait. He stoked the fire, trying not to listen to the murmured conversation drifting down from above. The afternoon light was fading when Hattie descended the stairs. Her face was troubled. That poor girl's been through more than she lets on, she said quietly. Baby's healthy enough, but she's worn to the bone. Running from something, if I'm any judge. Boone's hammer paused mid-strike. She'll need watching, Hattie continued. The baby could come any time in the next few weeks, and Mr. Calder? She fixed him with a sharp look. She mentioned a name, Marcus Whitley. If he comes asking, you never saw her. The hammer descended with more force than necessary. Understood. After Hattie left, Claire made her way carefully down the stairs. Mr. Calder? Might I help with something? I'm not used to sitting idle. Boone glanced up, surprised. Coffee pot's there, he said after a moment. If you've a mind to make some. She moved to the small stove in the corner, her movements precise despite her condition. My husband Thomas taught me to make Cowboy coffee, she said, measuring grounds into the pot. Before he joined the Army Patrol. Her voice caught slightly. Before the skirmish last year. Boone kept working, but his ears caught every word. His brother Marcus. She poured water into the pot, her hands trembling slightly. He claims the homestead's his now, says a woman can't hold title, especially not. She rested a hand on her belly. But Thomas filed the deed in both our names. He knew the risks of patrol duty. The hammer struck steady rhythm on the cooling metal. Boone didn't speak, but his silence was attentive. Marcus has friends in the railroad office, Claire continued softly. He's trying to force me to sign over the water rights. When I refused, her fingers touched her temple, where the bruises were fading. I had to leave, had to protect the baby. The plowshare gleamed in the forge light as Boone worked. Each strike shaped the metal, strengthened it. Like Claire's quiet voice shaped the evening air, strengthening something he'd thought long broken. When the coffee was ready, she poured 2 cups. The familiar scent filled the smithy, mingling with coal smoke and iron. She set 1 cup near his workbench, then settled on a stool, cradling her own cup in both hands. The silence between them was comfortable. Outside, evening settled over Willow Creek. A whip-poor-will called. The forge flames cast dancing shadows on the walls. You should rest, Boone said finally, setting aside the finished plowshare. Claire nodded, looking suddenly exhausted. Thank you, Mr. Calder, for everything. Boone, he said gruffly. Just Boone. She smiled faintly. Boone. She rose carefully, one hand steadying herself on the workbench. Good night, then, and the Lord is my shepherd, she murmured, starting up the stairs. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. The familiar psalm continued softly until she reached the loft. Soon, her breathing settled into the rhythm of deep sleep. Boone sat in his chair, watching the lamplight flicker across the rough floorboards. The smithy felt different with another soul under its roof. Warmer. Like spring thaw after a long winter. His fingers found the wooden cross he kept in his pocket, Annabeth's last gift. For 10 years, it had been a reminder of loss. Tonight, somehow, it felt more like a promise. Of what? He wasn't certain. The lamp burned low. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes called to the rising moon. Boone sat, listening to the quiet breathing from above, feeling the walls he'd built around his heart begin ever so slightly to crack. Dawn painted the sky in gentle strokes of pink and gold as Boone made his way down Willow Creek's quiet main street. His boots left clear prints in the morning dew that dampened the wooden sidewalk. The town was just stirring, smoke rising from chimneys, the smell of fresh bread from the bakers, horses nickering softly in their stalls. Sheriff Lowry was already at his desk when Boone entered the office. The lawman's weathered face creased in concentration over a stack of wanted posters. He looked up, surprise flickering across his features at the sight of the blacksmith. "Boone Calder," he said, setting down his coffee cup. "Been a while since you darkened my door." Boone removed his hat, turning it slowly in his hands. "Got a situation, Nathan?" The sheriff leaned back in his chair, studying him. "About that pregnant woman who rode in yesterday?" "Claire Whitley." Boone's voice was quiet but firm. "Her husband was Thomas Whitley. Died in an Army patrol skirmish last year. His brother Marcus is trying to force her off her rightful land." Sheriff Lowry's expression grew serious. "Marcus Whitley? The rancher from over Red Rock Way?" "Same." Boone's fingers tightened on his hat brim. "She's got bruises that ain't from falling." The sheriff cursed softly. "That complicates things." He stood, moving to pour a fresh cup of coffee. "Marcus has friends in the railroad office, connections with the territorial judge. If he files charges, claims she stole property or some such, harboring her could bring trouble." "She's carrying Thomas's child," Boone said. "The land's legally hers." "Law's one thing. Justice is another." Sheriff Lowry handed Boone a cup of coffee. "I'll keep my eyes open, but my hands are tied unless Marcus breaks the law clear enough that even his railroad friends can't ignore it." Boone nodded, understanding the warning. He left the sheriff's office and headed toward the church, where Preacher Davidson was tending his small garden of herbs and flowers. The preacher straightened as Boone approached, brushing dirt from his hands. "Brother Calder," he said warmly, "it does my heart good to see you here." Boone explained Claire's situation in careful, measured words. The preacher's kind face grew troubled. "The Lord sends us those in need for a reason," he said finally. "The church will help however we can. We'll make sure she has food, supplies." He paused, studying Boone. "Perhaps this is his way of leading you back to us, brother." Boone didn't respond to that, but he accepted the preacher's offered hand before turning back toward town. As he passed the church again later that morning, he caught sight of Claire through the open door. She was helping Hattie Bell sweep the vestibule, her movements careful but determined despite her condition. A small boy, Tommy Weber, the carpenter's son, sat on the steps, chattering away while Claire listened with a gentle smile. Boone paused, something catching in his chest at the sight. Claire's face was animated as she answered the child's questions, her eyes bright with warmth. For a moment, he remembered another woman's smile, another gentle voice. But the memory brought more warmth than pain this time. The day passed in the familiar rhythm of the forge. The ring of hammer on anvil, the hiss of hot metal in water, the creak of leather as he repaired harnesses. Claire rested in the loft, coming down occasionally to make coffee or sweep the workspace clear of coal dust, despite Boone's quiet insistence that she shouldn't strain herself. Late afternoon sun slanted through the smithy windows when Boone heard a sharp intake of breath from the back of the workshop. Claire stood there, a piece of paper trembling in her hands, her face gone pale. "Marcus," she whispered. "He's coming." She held out the telegram that had been delivered to the general store. "Mr. Peterson brought this over. Marcus knows I'm here." Boone took the paper, reading the terse message. "Arriving Willow Creek tomorrow, stop Claire, return home immediately, stop consequences, follow disobedience, stop." Claire's hands wrapped protectively around her middle. "I'll leave before dawn," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "I won't bring trouble to your door, Mr. Calder. You've been too kind already." Boone said nothing. He moved to his workbench, picked up his hunting knife, and began methodically sharpening the blade. The steady scrape of steel on whetstone filled the growing silence. "Did you hear me?" Claire asked. "I said I'll go." "No." The word was quiet but firm. "But Marcus will—" "No." Boone tested the knife's edge with his thumb, then reached for his gun belt, checking each bullet in the revolver. Claire watched him, tears gathering in her eyes. "I won't have you facing danger because of me. I won't have another man's blood on my hands." Boone looked up then, meeting her gaze. "Your husband died protecting what was right," he said softly. "Protecting you and his child." He slid the revolver back into its holster. "Sometimes that's what a man's called to do." He moved past her to check the heavy barn doors at the back of the smithy, testing the locks, then began moving empty barrels to create a defensive barrier if needed. Each movement was calm, deliberate, speaking of years of experience. "But why?" Claire's voice broke. "Why would you risk everything for a stranger?" Boone paused in his work, looking at the cross that hung on a nail by his forge, the one he'd put there that morning instead of carrying in his pocket. "Because 10 years ago I couldn't protect someone I loved," he said, the words coming slow but clear. "Been hiding from that truth ever since. Maybe the Lord's giving me another chance to do what's right." Claire sank onto a bench, one hand pressed to her heart. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Natural to be scared," Boone replied, continuing his preparations. "But you ain't alone anymore." The sun was setting now, painting the smithy walls in shades of gold and shadow. Outside, Willow Creek settled into evening quiet, unaware of the storm gathering on its horizon. Boone worked steadily, making ready while Claire sat watching, her hands clasped in silent prayer. The night settled deep over Willow Creek, broken only by the steady rhythm of steel on stone, as Boone methodically sharpened every tool in his smithy. The familiar motion brought comfort, each blade catching the lamplight as he tested its edge. Above, in the loft, Claire's soft footsteps creaked across the floorboards as she prepared for bed. Boone worked through his collection, files, chisels, axes, and hammers, until each held a razor's edge. The metallic whisper of blade on whetstone filled the quiet hours. When he finished with the tools, he gathered spare lumber and shutters from the storage shed, carrying them up to secure Claire's loft window. The boards went up quietly, Boone's skilled hands working the nails in with minimal sound. Claire watched from her cot, wrapped in a quilt against the spring night's chill. "You don't have to do all this," she whispered. Boone just nodded and continued working. The shutters would hold against most anything short of a battering ram. When he finished, he checked the trapdoor's hinges one last time before descending to his own bunk below. Dawn came too soon, painting the eastern sky in watercolor shades of pink and gold. Claire was already awake, her few belongings packed in a worn carpet bag. She made her way down the loft ladder, moving carefully with her swollen belly. "I should go," she said, setting the bag by the door. "Before Marcus arrives." Boone looked up from stoking the forge fire. "No," Mr. Calder, It's your right to stay. His voice was quiet, but firm. Your land. Your choice. Claire sank into the wooden chair by his workbench, one hand pressed to her lower back. The land dispute isn't simple, she said finally. Thomas, my husband, he had a proper deed with water rights, signed and witnessed by an army major last spring, before the skirmish that took him. Her fingers twisted in her apron. But Marcus claims it's invalid, says Thomas never filed it properly with the territory office. Boone set down his poker, giving her his full attention. Why does Marcus want it so bad? The railroad's buying up water rights all through the territory, offering good money. Claire's voice grew bitter. Marcus lost big gambling in Denver last winter. He needs that railroad money, and he needs it soon. But that land was Thomas's dream. Our dream. A place to raise our child. To build something lasting. Boone nodded slowly, considering. After a moment, he pulled on his coat. Come with me. They walked through the awakening town to the white-painted church where Preacher Davidson lived. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and wood smoke. The preacher was in his study, sorting through old records and letters. Brother Calder, Mrs. Whitley, he greeted them warmly. What brings you so early? Need to see the town land records, Boone said. From last spring? The preacher's eyebrows rose, but he asked no questions, simply leading them to a shelf of leather-bound books. The church keeps copies of important documents, he explained to Claire. Sort of an unofficial record office, you might say. They spent the next hour carefully going through the dusty volumes. Claire's fingers trembled slightly as she turned each page, hope and fear warring in her expression. Boone stood like a steady shadow behind her chair, his presence lending weight to their search. Just before noon, Claire gasped. Here, she breathed, pointing to a carefully recorded deed. This is it. Boone leaned closer to read the document. The deed was clearly written, properly witnessed, with explicit water rights noted. But it was the signature at the bottom that made his breath catch. Major Elias Calder, 7th Cavalry. Your husband's deed was witnessed by Major Calder? Boone's voice was rough. Claire looked up at him, puzzled by his reaction. Yes, he was Thomas's commanding officer. He signed it just before... She trailed off, studying his face. Mr. Calder, what is it? Boone stared at the familiar signature, his throat tight. Elias is my brother. Your brother? Claire's eyes widened. I had no idea. Thomas never mentioned... She stopped, understanding dawning. You didn't know he was in the area? Haven't seen him in 15 years. Boone's finger traced the bold signature. Not since he joined the army, and I stayed to work the ranch with Pa. The old pain of that separation echoed in his voice. Never knew he made major. Preacher Davidson had been quietly witnessing their discovery. Now he spoke up. This changes things considerably. With Major Calder's signature, the deed's validity is much harder to challenge. And if Boone can testify to his brother's signature... Marcus won't care about signatures, Claire said quietly. He's desperate. When desperate men want something badly enough, they make their own justice. Then we'll need to be ready for that too, Boone replied, his hand unconsciously moving to the knife at his belt. But his eyes stayed fixed on his brother's signature, as if trying to read 15 years of silence in those careful strokes of ink. Claire reached out hesitantly, touching his arm. I'm sorry, she said softly. I didn't mean to stir up painful memories. Boone finally looked away from the document, meeting her concerned gaze. Maybe it's time those memories were stirred. He straightened, squaring his shoulders. We'll make a copy of this deed. Then we wait for Marcus. The preacher was already gathering paper and ink. I'll witness the copy myself, he said, and I'll send word to Judge Harrison in Miller's Creek. He should know about this development. As they waited for the ink to dry, Claire watched Boone, seeing him with new eyes, not just as the quiet blacksmith who had offered her shelter, but as a man with his own deep hurts and unfinished stories. She wondered if perhaps God had brought them together for more reasons than just her protection. The spring sun climbed higher outside the church windows, warming the study's dark wood walls. They had found what they came for, but somehow Claire sensed that this discovery was just the beginning. The deed with its surprising signature lay between them like a bridge across years of pain and silence, connecting past to present in ways none of them could have foreseen. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the sheriff's office windows as Boone spread the copied deed across Lowry's weathered desk. The sheriff adjusted his spectacles, studying the document with careful attention while Claire stood nervously by the door, one hand resting protectively over her belly. "Major Elias Calder," Sheriff Lowry murmured, his finger tracing the signature. He glanced up at Boone. "Your brother's signature carries weight, especially with Army matters." The sheriff leaned back in his creaking chair. "But we'd need confirmation from the agency near Red Fork to make it completely solid. They keep Army records there." Claire's shoulders tensed at the mention of Red Fork. She'd noticed how Boone had flinched at the name earlier, seen the shadow cross his face. The sheriff was still talking, explaining legal particulars, but Claire watched Boone. His large hands were clenched at his sides, knuckles white. When they left the sheriff's office, Claire gathered her courage. "Mr. Calder," she said softly, "something about all this has you troubled. More than just Marcus coming." Boone walked several paces before answering, his boots stirring up dust from the wooden sidewalk. "Elias?" he said finally. "My brother. He vanished years ago. No word, no trace." He stopped, staring at the distant hills. "That signature on your deed. It's the first sign I've had of him in all that time." They walked slowly back toward the smithy. The spring wind carried the scent of coming rain, and dark clouds were building in the west. Claire remembered something, a conversation nearly forgotten in the chaos of Thomas's death and her flight from Marcus. "Thomas mentioned Major Calder once," she said carefully. "Said the Major had regrets about some treaty dispute, something about water rights and broken promises." She watched Boone's face. "Thomas said it weighed on him heavy." Boone's jaw tightened. "Sounds like Elias. Always carried the weight of things. Tried to make them right." Thunder rumbled in the distance as they reached the smithy. Claire paused at the door, looking up at Boone's troubled face. "I need to thank you proper," she said. "Let me fix supper. I saw you have a stove and I'm handy enough in a kitchen." Boone seemed startled by the offer, but after a moment he nodded. Claire set to work, grateful for something practical to do. She found cornmeal and bacon in Boone's modest stores, some dried beans, and a few wrinkled apples. The familiar tasks of cooking settled her nerves, measuring, mixing, tending the stove. She hummed softly as she worked, an old hymn her mother used to sing. The storm drew closer as Claire cooked, lightning flickering at the windows. She couldn't help glancing occasionally at Boone, who was working quietly at his bench, mending a bridle with careful stitches. His presence filled the room like the approaching thunder, powerful but contained. When the cornbread was golden brown and the beans were bubbling with bacon, Claire sat two places at Boone's small table. She'd found an old checkered cloth in a drawer and spread it carefully, smoothing the wrinkles. "Supper's ready," she called softly. Boone looked up from his work, surprise crossing his features at the sight of the set table. For a moment he didn't move, and Claire feared he might refuse. But then he set aside the bridle, washed his hands in the basin, and joined her at the table. It was the first time they'd sat down to eat together. Claire served the food with slightly trembling hands, suddenly shy. The storm broke outside, rain drumming on the roof as they began to eat in silence. "It's good," Boone said after a few bites, his quiet voice barely audible over the storm. Thank you. Claire broke off a piece of cornbread. My mother taught me to cook, said a woman should know how to make something from nothing. She smiled faintly. Came in handy out here. Lightning flashed, illuminating Boone's scarred hands as he reached for his cup. The thunder that followed seemed to shake the very foundations of the smithy. That land of yours, Boone said suddenly, his voice low but clear, may be the last thing my brother ever set right. Claire set down her fork, struck by the weight of sorrow in his words. The deed, the signature, the timing of it all. It wasn't just about her claim anymore. Somehow her struggle had become entangled with Boone's own unfinished story, his lost brother, his years of silence. Rain lashed the windows as they finished their meal, each lost in thought. The storm raged outside, but in the warmth of the smithy kitchen, something had shifted. A connection had formed, born of shared pain and unexpected grace, as delicate and real as the signature on Claire's deed. Claire gathered the dishes, moving carefully in the lamplight. She knew Marcus was still coming, knew tomorrow would bring its own storms. But tonight, watching Boone's broad shoulders bent over his empty plate, she felt an odd sense of peace. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Two wounded souls finding strength in each other's broken places. The thunder rolled on, and the rain fell steady on the roof of the smithy, nature's lullaby to two hearts beginning to heal. Morning light crept through the smithy windows, bringing with it the bustling sounds of Willow Creek awakening. Boone was already at his forge when Tom Wheeler, the telegraph operator, came hurrying across the muddy street. His usually cheerful face was drawn with concern. "Boone," Tom called out, waving a yellow paper, "you'll want to see this. Just got posted at the Mercantile." Boone set down his hammer and took the notice, his eyes narrowing as he read. The official letterhead of the Denver Pacific Railroad crowned the page, its bold letters declaring the Whitley homestead misfiled and reassigned. Below that, Clay Hardin's signature sprawled importantly beside Marcus Whitley's neat scrawl. "Clay's thrown in with Marcus," Tom explained, shifting uncomfortably. "Word is they're claiming the original deed was never properly registered with the Territory Office." Boone's jaw tightened. He'd known Clay Hardin since the man first rode into town as the railroad's local foreman, a smooth talker with cavalry manners and sharp eyes that missed nothing. If he was backing Marcus's claim, trouble wasn't far behind. Claire appeared in the smithy doorway, her face pale in the morning light. "What is it?" she asked, though her expression suggested she already knew. Boone handed her the notice, watching as she read it with trembling hands. "They can't do this," she whispered. "Thomas's deed, your brother's signature." "They can try," Boone said quietly. He turned to Tom. "Telegraph office open?" Tom nodded. "Just unlocked it myself." "Keep an eye on things here," Boone told him, already reaching for his coat. To Claire, he added, "Won't be gone long." The morning air was crisp as Boone strode toward the telegraph office, his boots leaving deep prints in the mud from yesterday's storm. Inside, he carefully wrote out his message to the Red Fork agency clerk, seeking confirmation stop. Last known actions, Major Elias Calder. Stop, specifically land deed, Whitley Homestead. Stop, urgent reply needed. Stop, Boone Calder Willow Creek. He watched Tom tap out the message, each click of the key sending hope and uncertainty along the wire. If the agency clerk could verify Elias's actions, it might give Claire's claim the legal weight it needed. When Boone returned to the smithy, he found Claire organizing his scattered tools, her hands keeping busy to ward off worry. She looked up as he entered, questions in her eyes. "Sent the wire," he said. "Now we wait." He hesitated, then added, "But there's something else we need to do." From a high shelf, Boone retrieved a wooden box he hadn't opened in years. Inside, nestled in oiled cloth, lay a Colt revolver, clean and well-maintained despite its long rest. Claire watched as he checked the cylinder and mechanism. "I don't know about guns," she said softly. "You need to learn." Boone's voice was gentle but firm. "Marcus might come before we hear back from Red Fork." They moved to the back of the smithy where Boone had set up old feed sacks stuffed with straw. He showed Claire how to hold the Colt, his large hands adjusting her grip with careful precision. "Keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to shoot," he instructed. "Point it like you're pointing your finger, both eyes open." Claire's hands shook at first, but steadied as Boone guided her through loading and unloading, explaining each step with patience. When she finally squeezed off her first shot, the bang echoed through the smithy, making her jump despite the warning. "Good," Boone said, noting the hole in the feed sack. "Again." They practiced until Claire could load and fire with growing confidence. The sun was setting when they finally stopped, the evening air cooling rapidly. Claire's arms ached, but she felt stronger somehow, more prepared. That night, after a simple supper of beans and cornbread, they sat in the warmth of the smithy. The forge's dying embers cast dancing shadows on the walls. Claire watched the flames, her thoughts heavy with the day's events. "Mr. Calder," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever think God's disappointed in us? In the choices we make?" Boone was silent for a long moment, stoking the embers with an iron rod. The question seemed to touch something deep within him, something that had been buried beneath years of grief and silence. "Sometimes," he finally said, his deep voice thoughtful, "I think God's just waiting for us to come in out of the cold." Claire turned to look at him, surprised by the simple wisdom in his words. In the fading firelight, she could see the years of pain etched in his face, but something else too. A softening around his eyes, a quiet awakening. "Like a father," she murmured, "leaving the light on." Boone nodded, still watching the embers. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with understanding. Outside, a whip-poor-will called into the gathering night, its lonely song echoing across the valley. Claire touched the revolver at her side, its weight both frightening and reassuring. Whatever tomorrow brought, Marcus, Clay Hardin, or word from Red Fork, she wasn't alone anymore. In this quiet smithy, with this quiet man, she had found something she thought she'd lost forever. Hope. The forge's last ember flickered and died, leaving them in the gentle glow of the oil lamp. Neither moved to break the peace of the moment, both understanding that sometimes the most important things are said in silence. The morning fog still clung to the telegraph office windows when Tom Wheeler burst through the smithy door, waving a yellow paper. His boots left muddy prints on the wooden floor, but Boone hardly noticed as he took the message with calloused hands. Deed confirmed, stop. Major Calder signed, water rights, transfer, stop. Official map copy in agency vault. Stop. Suggest personal retrieval for verification. Stop. Regards, James Morton Agency. Clerk, stop. Boone read the words twice, his heart beating faster with each line. Claire appeared at his elbow, her face tight with worry. "What does it say?" she asked softly. "Elias did sign it," Boone replied, his voice rough with emotion. "The clerk has proof at Red Fork." He turned to face her, determination settling over his features. "I need to ride out. First light tomorrow." Claire nodded, understanding in her eyes. "How long to Red Fork?" 3 days, if the weather holds." Boone folded the telegram carefully, tucking it into his shirt pocket. "I'll make it in 2. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the smithy floor, Boone pulled down a wooden box from the highest shelf. Dust coated its lid, the product of years untouched. Inside, wrapped in faded blue cloth, lay a leather-bound Bible. The spine was worn smooth from years of handling, its pages gilt-edged and well-thumbed. My mother's, Boone explained, holding it out to Claire. Might give you something to read while I'm gone. Claire took the Bible reverently, her fingers tracing the embossed cross on its cover. Thank you, she whispered. I'll keep it safe. Dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold as Boone led his bay gelding from the stable. He'd packed light, jerky, coffee, and hardtack in his saddlebags, his Winchester secured in its scabbard. Claire stood in the smithy doorway, the Bible clutched to her chest. Lord, she prayed aloud, her voice carrying clear in the morning stillness. Watch over him on the trail. Bring him safely back with the truth we need. Boone touched the brim of his hat, a gesture of acknowledgement that meant more than words. Then he swung into the saddle, the leather creaking beneath him. Without looking back, he rode east, his silhouette growing smaller against the rising sun. The first day's ride took him through familiar country, rolling hills dotted with oak and cedar, creek bottoms thick with cottonwood trees. By afternoon, he'd left Willow Creek's territory behind, pushing into wilder land. He made good time, stopping only to rest his horse and take quick meals of jerky and hardtack. As night fell, Boone made camp in a protected hollow. The spring air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and prairie grass. He built a small fire, more for company than warmth, and settled against his saddle to watch the stars emerge. The familiar constellations brought memories flooding back. Nights spent camping with Elias, tracking strays or running survey lines. His brother had known every star by name, could navigate by them better than any compass. Elias had been the steady one, the responsible one, until that treaty dispute changed everything. Where did you go, brother? Boone whispered to the night sky. The stars offered no answer, just their ancient, steady light. Back in Willow Creek, while Boone rode eastward under those same stars, Clay Harden pushed through the sheriff's office door. Sheriff Lowry looked up from his paperwork, his weathered face carefully neutral. Evening, Clay, the sheriff said, setting down his pen. What brings you by so late? Clay settled his lean frame into a chair, his cavalry boots gleaming in the lamplight. Heard Boone Calder rode out this morning, he said casually. Heading to Red Fork, word is. That's his business, I reckon, Lowry replied. Maybe. Clay leaned forward, his voice taking on an edge. But harboring that Whitley woman, interfering with legal railroad business, that's everybody's business, Sheriff. Legal, you say? Lowry's eyes narrowed slightly. Seems to me there's some question about those property rights. Marcus Whitley has a clear claim, Clay insisted. The railroad's prepared to compensate him fairly for the land. But Calder's stirring up trouble, making folks take sides? He stood, adjusting his coat. People might start wondering whose side you're on, Sheriff. I'm on the side of the law, Lowry said firmly. Always have been. Good to hear. Clay moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. Because things are going to change in Willow Creek, whether folks like it or not. Best be sure you're standing on the right side when they do. The door closed behind him with a decisive click, leaving Sheriff Lowry alone with his thoughts. He pulled out his pocket watch, studying its familiar face as if it might hold answers. Outside, a dog barked in the growing darkness, and somewhere down the street, a piano tinkled from the saloon. The sheriff walked to his window, watching Clay's figure disappear into the gathering dusk. The railroad man's words hung in the air like smoke, a warning wrapped in velvet. Lowry had kept peace in Willow Creek for 20 years, but he could feel trouble brewing now, thick as storm clouds on the horizon. In the smithy, Claire sat alone by lamplight, Boone's mother's Bible open on her lap. Her fingers traced the familiar words of Psalm 23, finding comfort in their ancient promise. She prayed again for Boone's safety, for truth to prevail, for strength to face whatever lay ahead. The lamp's flame flickered, casting long shadows on the smithy walls. Somewhere in the darkness, Boone was camped beneath the same stars that shone over Willow Creek, drawing closer to answers with every mile. But in town, like ripples spreading from a stone dropped in still water, the consequences of his journey were already beginning to spread. The Red Fork Agency rose from the prairie like a collection of weathered wooden boxes, its windows gleaming in the morning sun. Boone dismounted, his boots stirring dust in the yard. 2 days of hard riding had brought him here, following the ghost of his brother's last known steps. Inside the main office, ceiling fans stirred the warm air. A Navajo woman sat behind a broad desk, her silver jewelry catching the light as she looked up from a stack of papers. Her dark eyes studied Boone with quiet intelligence. "I'm Najoni Yazi," she said, her voice clear and professional. "How may I help you?" Boone removed his hat. Looking for information about Major Elias Calder. James Morton telegraphed about a land deed. Recognition flickered across her face. "Ah, yes. Morton mentioned you might come." She stood, smoothing her skirt. "I remember your brother well. He was one of the few agents who treated our people with respect." She crossed to a wall of filing cabinets, each drawer labeled with careful precision. The Major spent his last days here reviewing water rights agreements. He was troubled by some of the earlier treaties. Her fingers traced the drawer labels until she found what she sought. Here we are, 1873 land transfers. The drawer slid open with a metallic scrape. Najoni lifted out a leather portfolio, bringing it to her desk. "Your brother spoke often of making things right," she said, untying the portfolio's strings. "He believed in justice, even when it wasn't convenient." Inside lay a carefully preserved map, its edges crisp despite its age. Najoni spread it flat, pointing to markings in red ink. "These are the original survey lines, signed by Major Calder himself. The water rights are clearly marked. They belong to the Whitley homestead." Boone leaned closer, studying the precise drawings. His brother's signature stood bold at the bottom, along with the official agency seal. "This proves Claire's claim," he said quietly. "Yes." Najoni began making a certified copy. "The Major was adamant about protecting these rights. It was the last document he signed before—" She paused, glancing at Boone. "Before he disappeared." "Did he say anything? Leave any message?" Boone's voice roughened with long-held emotion. Najoni's hands stilled on the paper. "Only that he was headed north, toward Crow territory. He seemed burdened, like a man carrying a heavy truth." She finished the copy, stamping it with the agency seal. "Whatever happened, Mr. Calder, your brother tried to do what was right." Miles away in Willow Creek, afternoon shadows stretched across the smithy floor as Claire swept coal dust from the workbench. The door creaked open, and she turned, expecting to see Hattie Bell with more of her herbal tea. Instead, Marcus Whitley filled the doorway, his lean frame casting a long shadow. Behind him stood Clay Harden, looking almost apologetic in his well-cut coat. "Well, sister dear," Marcus said, his voice dripping false warmth. "Quite a cozy setup you've made here." Claire's hands tightened on the broom handle. "Get out," she said firmly. "You have no right to be here." "No right?" Marcus stepped closer, his boots scuffing the floor. "That's rich, coming from a woman squatting on my property." "It's not yours." Claire backed toward the forge, keeping the workbench between them. "Thomas left it to me and the baby." Clay cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitley, we're trying to be reasonable. The railroad needs that water access. We're prepared to offer fair compensation." "To the legal owner," Marcus cut in. "Which you're not." "I have the deed," Claire said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Signed by Major Calder himself." Marcus's face darkened. A convenient story. But where is this mysterious deed? He swept a stack of papers off the workbench, sending them fluttering to the floor. "Where's your protector now, Claire?" "Off chasing fairy tales while you hide behind his forge?" The crash of breaking glass made Claire jump. Clay had knocked over a lamp, oil spreading across the wooden floor. "Careful there, Clay," Marcus said, his tone mockingly concerned. "Place like this could go up like tinder." "That's far enough." Sheriff Lowry's voice cut through the tension. He stood in the doorway, one hand resting on his gun belt. "Step away from the lady." Marcus raised his hands, all innocence. "Just having a family discussion, Sheriff. Nothing to concern yourself with." "Discussion's over," Lowry said firmly. "Both of you, out. Now." Clay touched Marcus's arm. "Come on, we've made our point." They left, Marcus pausing in the doorway. "Think about what I said, Claire. Railroad's coming, whether you like it or not. Don't make things harder than they need to be." After they were gone, Sheriff Lowry helped Claire clean up the broken glass. "You all right?" he asked, studying her pale face. "Yes," Claire said, though her hands trembled slightly. "Thank you for coming when you did." "Might want to stay with Hattie Bell tonight," Lowry suggested, "just until Boone returns." Claire shook her head. "This is my home now. I won't be frightened away." The sheriff nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'll keep extra patrols around tonight, but be careful, Mrs. Whitley. Some men don't take kindly to being told no." As darkness settled over the prairie, Boone made camp in a sheltered draw a few miles outside Red Fork. The precious map copy lay secure in his saddlebags, proof of Claire's rightful claim. He built a small fire, more for company than warmth, and settled against his saddle. The stars emerged one by one, bright and clear in the vast sky. Somewhere out there, his brother had ridden into the darkness and never returned. But he'd left behind this one piece of justice, a deed that might save a widow and her unborn child. Boone pulled his blanket closer, unaware of the confrontation back in Willow Creek. His bay horse grazed nearby, reins dragging, while coyotes called in the distance. Tomorrow he'd start the ride home, carrying the truth Claire needed. But tonight, in his absence, she faced her enemies alone. A cool breeze stirred the prairie grass, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Boone added another stick to his fire, watching the sparks spiral upward toward the wheeling stars. The map in his saddlebags felt like both an answer and a burden, proof of his brother's final act of justice, and a challenge to those who would take what wasn't theirs. He settled back against his saddle, his Winchester close at hand. The fire's warmth and 2 days of hard riding soon pulled him into sleep. While back in Willow Creek, Claire sat awake in the darkened smithy, a loaded Colt revolver across her lap, watching the shadows for any sign of movement. Dawn light painted the hills gold as Boone rode into Willow Creek. 2 days of hard travel had left him saddle-weary, but the map in his saddlebags gave him purpose. He guided his bay horse down the quiet main street, past the shuttered general store and the church where early risers gathered for morning prayers. The smithy stood dark and silent. Something felt wrong before he even dismounted. The door hung crooked on its hinges, swaying in the morning breeze. Boone's heart quickened as he swung down from the saddle, boots hitting the packed earth with a soft thud. "Claire," he called, pushing the broken door wide. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating chaos. His tools lay scattered across the floor, workbench overturned, forge cold and dead. But it was the dark stain on the hearth that stopped his breath. Blood dried brown against the stone. "No," he whispered, moving forward on legs gone wooden. He touched the stain with trembling fingers. Images of Annabeth flooded back. Another woman he'd failed to protect. The familiar walls of grief closed in, threatening to drown him. A creaking floorboard made him whirl. Sheriff Lowry stood in the doorway, hat in his hands. The older man's face was lined with worry and something darker. Shame. "I'm sorry, Boone," Lowry said quietly. "Marcus's men came last night, just after sunset. 4 of them, armed, He swallowed hard. "They took her." Boone's hands clenched into fists. You let them?" His voice emerged as a growl. "By the time I heard the commotion, they were already riding out. I gathered a posse but lost their trail in the dark." Lowry stepped closer. "She fought them hard, Boone. That blood there, that's from Marcus's nose when Claire struck him." Pride mingled with fear in Boone's chest. He crossed to the overturned workbench, righting it with controlled fury. "Which way?" "Headed toward the Whitley land, up in the hills." Lowry watched as Boone began gathering supplies. "Marcus is claiming she stole property, using the law as cover. Says he's just bringing her home, but he means to force her to sign over the deed." Boone checked his Winchester, sliding fresh cartridges into place. The familiar motion steadied his hands. He retrieved the map from his saddlebags, showing it to Lowry. "I have proof now. The land is hers, legal and proper." "That won't matter to Marcus," Lowry warned. "He's desperate. The railroad's pressing him for those water rights. A desperate man with power is dangerous." Boone secured his rifle to his saddle and filled his canteen. Every movement was deliberate, focused. "Send word to the circuit judge," he said. "Have him meet us at the Whitley place, and gather men you trust. I may need backup." "You're going alone?" Lowry's concern was plain. "I'll move faster." Boone swung into the saddle, checking his pistol one last time. "Besides, Marcus knows me, knows I won't stop until I find her." The sheriff nodded slowly. "God go with you, Boone." Boone touched the brim of his hat and turned his horse toward the hills. The morning sun cast long shadows across the trail as he followed the hoof prints leading out of town. 4 horses, moving fast, but not careful enough to hide their path. The trail wound up into rocky country, where scrub oak and cedar dotted the hillsides. Boone rode steadily, letting his bay pick its way through the rough terrain. His eyes never left the ground, reading the story written in disturbed earth and broken twigs. Near noon, something pale caught his eye. He dismounted, kneeling to lift a familiar wool shawl from where it had snagged on a thorny bush. Claire's shawl, the one she wore while reading in the evenings. He could still smell the faint trace of wood smoke from his forge. Boone's hands tightened on the soft wool. Grief and rage warred in his chest, threatening to overwhelm him. But there was something else, too. Something he hadn't felt in years. Prayer rose unbidden to his lips. "Lord," he whispered, voice rough with emotion, "give me strength to find her. And forgiveness." He swallowed hard. Forgiveness for what I might have to do. The wind stirred the cedars, carrying the scent of rain. Boone tucked the shawl carefully into his saddlebags and remounted. The tracks led higher into the hills, toward the Whitley ranch where Claire's nightmare had begun, where it would end, one way or another. His bay's hooves struck stone, sending hollow echoes through the canyons. Boone rode on, shoulders set with grim determination. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, but shadows still lurked in the deep draws and arroyos. Somewhere ahead, Claire waited, counting on him to find her, to make things right. He touched the map in his breast pocket, feeling the crisp paper that proved her claim. His brother's last act of justice would not be in vain. Boone urged his horse forward, faith and fury driving him deeper into the hills, following the trail that would lead him to Claire, and to whatever darkness awaited at journey's end. The wind picked up, carrying dust and the promise of coming storm. But Boone pressed on, reading the signs left in the earth, driven by a purpose stronger than fear or doubt. He would find her. He had to find her. And this time, he wouldn't fail. Night crept across the hills like spilled ink, turning the rocky terrain into a maze of deeper shadows. Boone tracked the wagon trail by moonlight, his bay horse picking its way carefully through the scrub oak and limestone outcrops. The spring air held a sharp chill, carrying the scent of cedar and distant wood smoke. He'd found signs of their passing all afternoon. Broken branches, fresh wheel ruts, a water flask dropped in haste. Now, as the moon rose full and bright over the ridgeline, Boone spotted a flicker of lamplight through the trees. The abandoned hunting shack sat tucked against a hillside on the edge of Whitley land, its weathered walls barely visible in the darkness. Boone dismounted quietly, leading his horse into a grove of cedars. He secured the reins and moved forward on foot, staying in the shadows. His boots made no sound on the rocky ground. Years of hunting had taught him how to move like a ghost. 2 horses and a wagon stood hitched outside the shack. Boone recognized Marcus's big sorrel stallion, its coat gleaming dully in the moonlight. He circled the clearing slowly, keeping to the tree line. Voices drifted through the night air, men arguing in harsh whispers. "Can't keep her here forever," Clay Hardin was saying, his voice tight with frustration. "The sheriff will be looking by now." "Let him look." Marcus's reply dripped with contempt. "By the time they find us, she'll have signed those papers, one way or another." "This wasn't part of the deal," Clay protested. "The railroad wants clean title, not—" "The railroad will get what it wants," Marcus cut him off. "You just make sure your bosses understand that sometimes business gets messy." Boone's jaw clenched as he completed his circuit of the shack. A single window glowed with lamplight on the far side. Through the grimy glass, he could make out Claire's figure, sitting against the wall with her arms wrapped around her middle. Even in the dim light, he could see the pain etched on her face. His heart nearly stopped when she doubled over, one hand pressed to her swollen belly. Labor. The baby was coming. Boone's hands tightened on his rifle stock, but he forced himself to stay still, to think. Rushing in now could get them both killed. He found a position where he could watch both the door and window, settling in to wait. The hours crept by like molasses. Clouds drifted across the moon, casting shifting shadows through the trees. Inside the shack, Claire's quiet gasps of pain grew more frequent. Marcus and Clay continued their heated discussion, their voices rising and falling with the night wind. Boone caught fragments about railroad contracts, water rights, and mounting debts. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Marcus was desperate, drowning in failed schemes and broken promises. False dawn began to paint the eastern sky when Boone made his move. He left his rifle propped against a tree and walked openly toward the shack's door. His spurs rang softly on the packed earth. No point in complete silence now. He wanted them to hear him coming. The voices inside went quiet. Boone stopped at the door and knocked twice, firmly. Then, before anyone could respond, he pushed it open and stepped inside. The lamp on the table cast jumping shadows across the room's rough wooden walls. Marcus stood by the cold fireplace, his hand dropping to his holstered pistol. Clay backed away toward the far corner, eyes wide with surprise. And Claire sat huddled on a narrow cot, her face pale but determined. "Boone," she whispered, relief and fear mingling in her voice. Marcus's gun cleared leather with a metallic rasp. Boone moved like lightning, closing the distance in 2 long strides. His left hand caught Marcus's gun arm, twisting savagely. The pistol clattered to the floor as Marcus yelped in pain. Boone's right fist followed through, catching Marcus hard in the jaw. The bigger man stumbled backward, crashing into the stone fireplace. Clay started forward, reaching for his own weapon. Boone pivoted smoothly and drove his fist into Clay's stomach, doubling him over. A second blow to the side of his head sent the railroad man sprawling unconscious across the rough plank floor. Marcus pushed himself up, spitting blood. "You got no right," he snarled. "This is family business." "She's not yours to break." Boone's voice was quiet but carried the weight of steel. He stepped between Marcus and Claire, his presence filling the small room. "The land is hers, legal and proper, with your brother's signature and Major Calder's seal." "That land belongs to the Whitleys." Marcus lunged forward, face twisted with rage. Boone caught him with another devastating punch that sent him reeling back against the wall. This time Marcus stayed down, blood trickling from his split lip. Behind them, Claire gasped sharply. Boone turned to find her clutching her belly, face contorted in pain. "The baby," she managed between clenched teeth. "It's coming." Boone crossed to her side, touching her shoulder gently. "Hold on," he said softly. "Help is coming." He turned back to Marcus, who was struggling to sit up. "The sheriff and circuit judge are riding this way. They'll have papers proving Claire's claim." His voice hardened. "And testimony about your part in this." Marcus slumped, the fight draining from him. "The railroad," he began weakly. "Can find another route," Boone finished. "One that doesn't steal a widow's birthright." Claire cried out again, grabbing Boone's hand. Her fingers were ice cold, her face sheened with sweat. Dawn light was starting to filter through the grimy window, painting the room in shades of gray and gold. Boone squeezed her hand gently, then moved to secure Marcus and Clay with rope from his saddlebags. The sound of approaching horses filtered through the early morning air. The sheriff's posse, right on time. He offered up a silent prayer of thanks, then returned to Claire's side. She looked up at him through pain-glazed eyes. "You came?" she whispered. "Had to," he replied simply. "Promised I'd keep you safe." Another contraction gripped her, and she clutched his hand harder. Outside, voices called out, boots crunched on gravel. But Boone stayed focused on Claire, supporting her as the new day dawned and new life prepared to enter the world. The sheriff's heavy knock echoed through the small shack. "Boone? You in there?" "Come on in," Boone called back, never taking his eyes off Claire. "And bring the midwife. We're gonna need her." The sheriff and midwife burst through the door of the hunting shack, letting in a gust of cold morning air. Boone was already clearing space near the stone hearth, shoving aside broken furniture and Marcus's scattered papers with his boot. "Get that fire going," the midwife, Martha Wheeler, ordered as she hurried to Claire's side. "And fetch water from the creek. We'll need plenty of it hot." Boone nodded silently and grabbed a rusted bucket. Outside, the sheriff's deputies were leading Marcus and Clay away in irons, their forms disappearing into the misty dawn. He strode to the creek, breaking through a thin crust of ice to fill the bucket. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of what was happening. Back inside, he stacked kindling and struck a match. The dry wood caught quickly, sending welcome warmth through the shabby room. Claire lay on a makeshift bed of blankets near the growing fire, her face tight with pain, but her eyes bright with determination. "Boone," she called softly. He crossed to her side, and she gripped his calloused hand. "Stay, please." Martha looked up from examining Claire. "We could use his help," she said. "This baby's coming fast." Boone swallowed hard, but nodded. He'd helped birth countless calves and foals over his years ranching. But this was different. This was Claire's child, a new life entering the world in the midst of struggle and hope. The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Boone kept the fire fed and the water hot, following Martha's clipped instructions. He supported Claire's back when she needed to shift position, wiped her brow with a cool cloth, and listened as she whispered fragments of scripture between contractions. "The Lord is my shepherd," she breathed, squeezing his hand so tight her knuckles went white. "I shall not want—" "That's right, dear," Martha encouraged. "Keep praying, keep breathing. The baby's almost here." Sunlight streamed through the dirty window, casting long shadows across the plank floor. Claire cried out sharply, and Martha nodded to Boone. "It's time. I need you to help catch this little one." Boone positioned himself where Martha directed, his heart pounding. Claire pushed with all her strength, her prayers turning to gasps of effort. And then, in a rush of miracle and wonder, the baby slipped into Boone's waiting hands. "It's a boy," Martha announced, helping Boone clear the infant's airways. A lusty cry filled the shack, strong and full of life. Tears streamed down Claire's cheeks as Boone carefully laid the swaddled newborn in her arms. "Oh," she whispered, touching the baby's tiny face. "Oh, thank you, Lord." Boone sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the moment. He'd helped bring this new life into the world, this perfect, precious child. His throat felt tight with emotion he couldn't name. Martha bustled around, cleaning up and checking on mother and baby. The sheriff stepped in briefly to report that Marcus and Clay were safely jailed in town, awaiting the circuit judge's arrival. "The land is yours, ma'am," he said kindly to Claire. "That deed your husband left you is ironclad, especially with Major Calder's seal. No railroad can take it now." Claire nodded, but her attention was fixed on her son's face. After the sheriff left, she looked up at Boone with eyes full of gratitude and something deeper. "I want to name him Boone," she said softly. "Boone Whitley. To honor the man who helped bring him into this world and who protected his birthright." Boone's breath caught in his chest. He stared at the tiny bundle, this new life who would now carry his name. The baby's small hand escaped the blanket, fingers curling around Boone's rough thumb with surprising strength. "Welcome home, little one," he managed to say past the lump in his throat. Welcome home to a land that was rightfully his, to a legacy of honor restored through his mother's courage and his namesake's protection. Martha smiled knowingly as she gathered her things. "I'll send the wagon to take you both back to town once you're ready," she said. "That little fellow needs a proper bed, not this drafty old shack." But Boone barely heard her leave. He was lost in wonder, watching Claire cradle their future in her arms, while morning light painted the world in shades of new beginning. The wagon swayed gently as it made its way back to Willow Creek, every care taken to smooth the journey for Claire and her newborn son. Boone rode alongside on his horse, eyes constantly scanning the trail ahead. The morning sun cast long shadows through the cottonwoods, and spring birds called from the budding branches above. Claire sat nestled in clean blankets in the wagon bed, cradling little Boone against her chest. Martha Wheeler fussed over them both, adjusting the shadecloth to keep the sun from the baby's face. The infant slept peacefully, one tiny fist curled against his mother's shawl. As they approached town, the church bells began to ring, their clear tones carrying across the valley. It was Easter Sunday morning, and townsfolk in their finest clothes were already gathering outside the whitewashed chapel. Heads turned as the wagon rolled past, and whispers rippled through the crowd. Sheriff Lowry stood on the steps of his office, watching as two deputies loaded Marcus and Clay into a prison wagon bound for the territorial court. "Don't show your faces in Willow Creek again," the sheriff warned, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "Next time won't be so gentle." Marcus glared, but said nothing as the wagon rattled away. Clay kept his eyes down, his smooth manner gone to dust. The sheriff tipped his hat to Boone as the group passed, a gesture of respect that carried weight with the watching townspeople. The wagon drew up in front of Boone's smithy, where Hattie Bell waited with fresh linens and a pot of bone broth simmering on the stove. "Bring that sweet baby inside where it's warm," she called, hurrying down the steps to help. Boone dismounted and gently lifted Claire from the wagon, supporting her as she carried the baby into the smithy. The familiar scent of coal smoke and iron mixed with the fresh herbs Hattie had scattered about. Someone had swept the floors clean and placed wildflowers in tin cups on the windowsills. "The whole town's been helping," Hattie explained, showing them how she'd transformed the loft into a proper nursery. Even old Thompson from the lumber mill sent over a cradle his wife saved from their children's days. Claire's eyes filled with tears at the unexpected kindness. She settled into a rocking chair while Hattie and Martha tended to her needs. Boone stood quietly by the door, the official deed papers still tucked safely in his vest pocket. Later that morning, the chapel filled to bursting as Reverend Stone called the Easter service to order. Sunlight streamed through the plain glass windows, catching the dust motes that danced in the air. The congregation turned as one when Boone appeared in the doorway, Claire on his arm with baby Boone wrapped in a soft white blanket. Whispers of wonder swept through the pews as Boone guided Claire to a seat near the front. He hesitated only a moment before sliding in beside her, his large frame fitting awkwardly in the narrow space. It was the first time he'd sat in these pews since losing Annabeth all those years ago. Hattie dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief from her seat across the aisle. Other women sniffled softly, moved by the sight of the tiny family. Even the men cleared their throats gruffly, touched by what they were witnessing. Reverend Stone smiled warmly from the pulpit. "On this Easter Sunday," he began, his voice carrying to the rafters, "we celebrate not only our Lord's resurrection, but also new life in our midst. Today we welcome Boone Whitley, born in the dawn hours, son of Claire Whitley, and namesake of our own Boone Calder, whose courage helped bring this child safely into the world." The preacher held up the official deed papers. "We also celebrate justice restored, as young Boone's birthright is secured through this document, signed by the late Major Elias Calder and now confirmed by territorial authority. Let us give thanks for God's providence in bringing truth to light." "Amen," the congregation murmured. Claire held her son close, tears slipping down her cheeks. Boone sat straight-backed beside her, his face composed but his eyes bright with emotion. The service continued with hymns of praise and prayers of thanksgiving. When the final notes of "Amazing Grace" faded away, the townspeople gathered around to welcome the baby and congratulate Claire. Hands reached out to pat Boone's shoulder. Faces smiled that had long turned away. The prodigal son had returned to the fold. As evening settled over Willow Creek, peace descended on the smithy. The last well-wishers had gone home, leaving behind covered dishes and small gifts for the baby. Lamplight cast a warm glow through the windows as Claire nursed her son, humming softly. Boone built up the fire and set the kettle to boil for tea. The familiar tasks felt different now, weighted with new meaning. When Claire finished nursing, she carefully transferred the baby to Boone's arms. "Would you rock him while I change?" she asked softly. "He seems to settle well with you." Boone nodded, cradling the tiny form against his chest. He settled into the rocking chair, moving it gently with one foot. The baby made small, snuffling sounds, his eyes already drooping closed. Claire's voice drifted down from the loft, sweet and clear as she sang an old lullaby. "All through the night, guardian angels God will send thee. Soft the drowsy hours are creeping, hill and vale in slumber sleeping." Boone closed his eyes, letting the peace of the moment wash over him. The weight of the sleeping child in his arms anchored him to this new reality, one where love and trust had found their way back into his life. The iron walls he'd built around his heart were finally crumbling, replaced by something stronger. Faith in tomorrow. Outside, the last rays of sunset painted the sky in shades of hope. Easter Sunday was drawing to a close in Willow Creek, but for Boone Calder, Claire Whitley, and the miracle they cradled between them, it was just the beginning. The morning sun warmed the telegraph office windows as Jimmy Fletcher tapped out his usual morning reports. His fingers paused over the brass key when an urgent message from Denver Pacific headquarters began clicking through. He scribbled quickly, then read it twice to be sure. With a low whistle, he grabbed his hat and hurried across the dusty street to Boone's smithy. Claire was sitting in the rocking chair near the open door, little Boone sleeping peacefully in her arms. The blacksmith looked up from his workbench as Jimmy burst in, waving the yellow paper. "Just came through from Denver," Jimmy announced, slightly out of breath. "The railroad's backing down. They're changing the route to avoid any legal trouble over the water rights." He handed the telegram to Boone, who read it carefully before passing it to Claire. Her hands trembled as she took in the words. "They're really giving up?" she whispered. "The land is safe?" Boone nodded, his expression softening as he watched her hold the baby closer. "It's yours free and clear now. Yours and his." Tears spilled down Claire's cheeks as months of fear finally lifted from her shoulders. The baby stirred, and she pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead. "Thank you," she said, looking up at Boone. "For everything." Later that week, Boone loaded his wagon with tools and lumber, then drove out to Claire's homestead. The cabin had suffered during her absence. A broken window, a sagging door, winter debris scattered across the yard. But the bones were solid, like the woman who owned it. He worked steadily through the days, replacing the weathered door with one he'd crafted himself. The new pine boards gleamed golden in the sunlight, and the iron hinges, his own handiwork, swung smooth and true. In the evenings, he sat at his workbench in the smithy, carefully carving delicate patterns into the wooden cradle he was building for the baby. Claire watched him work sometimes, admiring how his large hands could shape both iron and wood with such care. The baby slept nearby in a basket, his tiny fingers curled into fists. The quiet companionship between them grew stronger with each passing day. When the cradle was finished, Boone surprised himself by adding a final touch, a small cross carved into the headboard, like the one his mother's Bible bore. He rubbed linseed oil into the wood until it glowed warm and rich in the lamplight. Spring settled fully over Willow Creek, painting the hills in tender green. Each morning, Boone would walk with Claire and the baby into town, carrying the infant's basket while she visited the general store or stopped to talk with friends. His silence of 10 years melted away bit by bit, like winter snow in sunshine. "Beautiful morning," he'd say, or "Mind that mud hole ahead." Small words, but they felt like poetry after so long without speaking. Claire would smile encouragingly, and sometimes their hands would brush as they walked side by side. One afternoon, while Claire was teaching little Boone to nurse, Boone slipped out to the meadow behind his smithy. He returned with a handful of wild columbine and Indian paintbrush, their colors bright against his dark shirt. Claire's face lit up when he presented them to her, and she immediately began arranging them in one of Hattie's borrowed mason jars. "They're beautiful," she said, her smile radiant as the spring sunshine streaming through the window. Boone felt something shift in his chest, like iron softening in the forge. That evening, after Claire had put the baby down in his new cradle, she joined Boone by the hearth. The fire painted everything in soft gold, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called. Boone stoked the flames, then slowly knelt beside the stone hearth. His voice was rough with emotion when he spoke. "You've given me a reason to live again." Claire's breath caught at the raw honesty in his words. She reached out and touched his hand, feeling the calluses earned from years of working iron and hiding from life. "When Annabeth died," he continued, "I thought that was the end of everything worth living for. I built walls higher than the hills around my heart." He looked down at their joined hands. "But you and that baby, you've shown me there's still good in this world. Still hope." Claire squeezed his fingers gently. "God doesn't want us to walk alone," she said softly. "Sometimes he sends angels in disguise, even tired ones on worn-out horses." A ghost of a smile touched Boone's lips. "Reckon he does at that." The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney like stars seeking their home in the heavens. In his cradle, little Boone sighed in his sleep, secure in the knowledge that he was loved and protected. Claire's other hand came to rest on Boone's shoulder, and he leaned into the touch like a flower turning toward the sun. Neither spoke for a long while. They didn't need to. The quiet between them was filled with understanding, with possibilities as endless as the prairie sky. Through the open window, the sweet scent of spring flowers drifted in on the evening breeze, promising new beginnings and second chances. The May morning dawned clear and bright over Willow Creek. Dew sparkled on the new grass, and meadowlarks called from fence posts as Boone walked the familiar path to Claire's cabin. His heart beat steady but quick beneath his Sunday shirt, and the folded papers in his vest pocket seemed to weigh more than any iron he'd ever worked. Little Boone was already awake when he arrived, cooing in his cradle while Claire prepared breakfast. The cabin smelled of coffee and fresh-baked biscuits. She smiled warmly when Boone stepped through the door he'd built with his own hands. "Thought we might take a walk this morning," he said softly, lifting the baby into his arms. "Up by the spring, if you're willing." Claire's eyes held a question, but she nodded. "Let me fetch my shawl." They walked together through the meadow, following the well-worn path that led to the disputed water source that had caused so much trouble. But today, the spring bubbled peacefully among the rocks, its clear water catching sunlight like scattered diamonds. Above the spring, a stand of old cottonwoods provided cool shade. Their leaves whispered in the morning breeze, a sound like gentle prayers. Boone settled the baby more securely in the crook of his arm, then reached into his vest with his free hand. "Been meaning to show you something," he said, withdrawing the folded papers. His fingers trembled slightly as he handed them to Claire. She opened them carefully, her brow furrowing as she read. This is a deed transfer," she said, "from the Denver Pacific Railroad Company for the adjacent 100 acres. She looked up at him, confused. "Boone?" He shifted the baby gently, gathering his courage. "Bought it last week. Railroad was eager to sell, after everything." He paused, watching her face. "Thing is, I don't want it just for myself." Claire's breath caught as understanding dawned in her eyes. "These past weeks," Boone continued, his voice rough with emotion, "watching you with little Boone, seeing how you face each day with such faith and strength." He swallowed hard. "Made me realize I don't want to just be your protector anymore. I want to be your partner, in all things." Tears welled in Claire's eyes as Boone went on, his words coming easier now, like a spring breaking through winter ice. "I know I ain't much for talking usually, and maybe I'm too broken to deserve such happiness, but if you'd have me—" He gestured to the deed. "We could join the lands, join our lives, raise little Boone together, and maybe—" His voice softened. "Maybe find more blessings along the way." Claire's hands trembled as she held the papers. A tear slipped down her cheek, catching the morning light. "You're not broken," Boone called her, she whispered. "You're the strongest, gentlest soul I've ever known." She stepped closer, reaching up to touch his weathered cheek. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." The baby chose that moment to gurgle happily, making them both laugh. Boone's free arm slipped around Claire's waist, drawing her close. Above them, the cottonwood leaves danced in the sunshine, and the spring sang its eternal song of renewal. 3 days later, the entire town gathered at the white-painted church. Flowers decorated every pew, columbine and Indian paintbrush that the children had gathered from the hillsides. Claire wore a simple blue dress with a crown of white daisies in her hair. Little Boone, dressed in a christening gown made from Claire's wedding dress, slept peacefully in Hattie Bell's arms. Boone stood tall at the altar, his dark suit brushed free of smithy dust, his eyes never leaving Claire as she walked down the aisle. The preacher's words rang clear in the sunlit church, speaking of love's power to heal and restore. "Do you," Boone called her, "take this woman?" "I do." His voice was firm and sure. "And do you, Claire Whitley?" "I do." Her smile could have lit the darkest night. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, the entire congregation broke into cheers and happy tears. Even old Gus from the feed store was seen wiping his eyes with a bandana. Little Boone woke and added his own joyful coos to the celebration. That evening, after the townspeople had gone home and the baby was sleeping soundly in his cradle, Boone and Claire stood together in their cabin. The spring night was warm, and through the open window came the sound of crickets and the soft murmur of running water from the spring. Boone drew Claire into his arms, holding her close as if she might disappear like a dream. But she was real, wonderfully, beautifully real. Her head fit perfectly against his chest, right above his heart. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair. "For what?" "For bringing me back to life, for showing me that love's worth the risk of pain." Claire lifted her face to his. "God never abandoned you, Boone. He was just waiting for the right time to heal your heart." Outside, the spring flowed freely down the hillside, its waters bringing life to the joined lands below. Inside, two hearts beat as one, finally whole, finally home. Little Boone slept peacefully in his carved cradle, the moonlight touching the small cross on its headboard with silver light. Through the open window drifted the sweet scent of wild roses and the promise of summer. The land was restored, and with it, two souls who had found their way through darkness into light, together. Thanks for watching. Stories like this shape us in ways we don't always expect. If something resonated, subscribe. I'm back tomorrow with another one worth hearing.